Is there a reason you're standing here watching people eat? The officer snapped, his hand already near his utility belt. Before she could respond, he added, "You make folks uncomfortable when you just stand there, you know?" No one had spoken to her yet. No one had asked if she needed help or why she was there. And certainly no one had offered a table. A few heads turned. Some looked confused, others curious. But the tone had been set. Loud, sharp, and accusatory. The woman, tall and composed, said nothing. She hadn't taken a seat yet. She hadn't even stepped beyond the reception desk at the Lakeside Bistro, a high-end restaurant nestled along Charleston's waterfront. She had arrived for a pre-scheduled meeting, one she didn't dare miss. Her name was Naomi Ellison, and she wasn't there to eat. She was there to arrest the city's police chief. But they didn't know that yet. Where are you from? Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in the world, hit that subscribe button and share this story. Naomi had arrived precisely 3 minutes before the scheduled rendezvous. Her heels clicked softly on the tiled floor as she walked in. Neatly pressed slacks, fitted blazer, her locks pulled into a professional twist bun. No fanfare, no entourage, just presence. The hostess stand was unattended, but the place wasn't busy. It was the kind of establishment where tables were always wiped before you sat down, where iced water arrived before menus, and where business deals were quietly sealed with nods over rosemary bread. But today, that calm was cut through by a young uniformed officer named Darren Cray, sitting at a corner table. He wasn't supposed to be there either. Naomi spotted him before he noticed her. It wasn't difficult. He was the kind who puffed up when in uniform, back straight, arms folded, scanning every face for trouble that didn't exist. She wasn't surprised when he stood up and made a beeline toward her. His gaze scanned her top to toe, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. His voice, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear, carried a certainty not grounded in fact. He didn't ask questions. He didn't introduce himself. He issued warnings. Subtle at first, veiled as concern, but soon bold, confrontational. Naomi didn't flinch. She wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of encounter. In her line of work, being underestimated was practically routine. But today it wasn't just offensive. It was dangerous. She was operating under a sealed federal order. The warrant in her bag was time-sensitive. She needed to get to table 6 within the next 10 minutes. A missed window meant the target, Chief Vincent Morel, could walk free, or worse, be tipped off. And instead, here she was, being blocked by a beat cop with a fragile ego and unchecked bias. The officer continued speaking, growing louder, like a schoolteacher berating a student. Naomi wasn't loitering. She wasn't disruptive. She was simply existing. And in this setting, that seemed to be enough to trigger suspicion. Officer Cray's partner, who had trailed behind, stayed silent. He watched with a furrowed brow but said nothing. His silence wasn't neutral, it was consent. Naomi remained still. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pull rank. She had learned long ago that power didn't always need to be loud. She let the room grow tense. Let the stares build. Let the officer's words echo. Because what was about to unfold didn't need defense. It needed witnesses. Naomi was used to operating in rooms that didn't expect her. It came with the job, Federal Internal Affairs, Special Investigations Unit. Her role wasn't glamorous. It wasn't high-profile. But it was crucial. Corruption doesn't always show up in headline-grabbing scandals. Sometimes it appears in how departments bury evidence, in how officers cover for each other, in how power is passed quietly, without question, between those who've never had to fear its consequences. She'd spent the last 4 months investigating Charleston's police leadership, whistleblower testimonies, missing body cam footage, unfiled reports. It all pointed to one man, Chief Vincent Morel, well-liked, deeply connected, and until today, untouchable. The restaurant had been chosen precisely because it was neutral, public enough to avoid drama, but discreet enough for arrest. Or so they thought. Now, that plan was unraveling before it even began. As Officer Cray continued to speak, now questioning her presence, asking if she was waiting for someone, suggesting she find a better place to stand, Naomi internally timed her next move. She glanced at her watch. 12:42 p.m. She had 5 minutes before her backup arrived. She could have ended it then, pulled out her badge, flashed the warrant, and ended the theater. But she didn't, because the performance wasn't hers to stop. She knew what he was doing wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern. And patterns don't break when interrupted. They break when exposed. So she let it build. She let the customers nearby lean in closer. She let the whispers ripple. She let the officer's voice ring just a bit too loud for comfort. And she waited for the moment when the truth would be louder than any accusation. This wasn't the first time someone had assumed she didn't belong. But it might be the last time Officer Cray made that mistake. Because in less than 10 minutes, the woman he called a threat would be leading his boss out in handcuffs. And the entire restaurant was about to find out who Naomi Ellison really was. The sound in the restaurant had changed. What once was the quiet hum of forks on plates and light music had turned into low murmurs and awkward glances. Naomi Ellison stood still, poised, composed, and completely unshaken. Yet the air around her was heavy. Heavier than it should have been for a place like this. Officer Darren Cray had now taken a more aggressive stance. His voice had dropped lower, but his body language had grown louder. The hand near his belt lingered there a little too long. His jaw was set tight. He had that look, the one that comes when someone feels their authority is being questioned, even though no one had said a word. Naomi hadn't moved. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. But to Officer Cray, her silence was a challenge. He wasn't used to people, especially black women, standing firm without shrinking. He stepped in closer, almost as if to test how far he could push. Every word out of his mouth came with an edge, like he was trying to provoke a reaction. But Naomi didn't flinch. Not because she was cold or fearless. She simply couldn't afford to react. Every second she stayed calm was a second closer to her backup arriving. Still, the pressure was building. Customers had stopped pretending not to watch. A few paused mid-bite, eyes fixed on the scene unfolding by the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was charged. The kind of energy people feel in their chests before something bad happens. The kind of scene too many people had seen play out on the internet, always ending the same way. And yet, Naomi remained still. This wasn't her first time being seen as a problem for simply existing. Not the first time her posture, her confidence, her skin made people uncomfortable. But that didn't make it easier. Even as a federal agent with authority that outranked nearly everyone in that building, she still had to play the game of patience. Because black women like her were rarely given the benefit of the doubt. And because the man she was there to arrest, Chief Vincent Morrell, was still at table 6, sipping coffee with his back to the entire situation. Naomi could feel her heart beating faster, not out of fear, but out of frustration. There was a job to do, a time-sensitive mission. But now it was tangled in someone else's prejudice. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was trained for high-pressure moments. She could handle courtrooms, investigations, even confrontation. But this kind of tension, this kind didn't come from danger, it came from being misjudged. The manager arrived just as things were starting to feel worse. He didn't speak with Naomi. He didn't even make eye contact. His first words were directed to the officer. Naomi watched quietly as they spoke in hushed tones just out of her earshot. The officer gestured toward her. The manager nodded. Then, finally turning toward her, the manager cleared his throat and asked, politely but firmly, if she could step outside for just a moment. Not can I help you? Not is everything all right? Just an instruction to leave. To not cause a scene. To make the discomfort go away. Naomi blinked slowly. She realized then that the manager hadn't come to de-escalate the situation. He had come to smooth it over for the officer. For the business. Not for the person being treated unfairly. Not for the woman silently enduring the weight of two men's assumptions. Her pulse ticked in her ears. She stayed quiet. Every time Naomi didn't respond, it seemed to push the officer further. He couldn't understand why she wasn't scared. Why she wasn't apologizing. Why she wasn't shrinking like so many others had before her. Because in his mind, someone who looked like her couldn't possibly be the person in charge of anything. Certainly not of him. The officer's tone shifted again. He spoke slower now, condescending. Words like non-compliant and refusing to cooperate began to slip out. He was building a case around nothing, using the kind of language that too often showed up in reports to justify violence. Naomi knew the signs. She had read hundreds of those reports in her career. She had seen how innocent moments turned into fatal ones through the lens of poor judgment and unchecked power. And now she was living one. Still, she didn't move. She checked her watch again. 12:46 p.m. 3 minutes to go. She could feel the atmosphere shifting even more. Her presence, her silence, her stillness. They were no longer seen as neutral. They were now being viewed as dangerous. And that perception, especially from a man in uniform, could turn deadly fast. But Naomi wasn't afraid. She was focused. Behind the officer, 2 customers had begun filming quietly. One held her phone in her lap, angled upward. Another man leaned back in his chair, camera facing forward, pretending to scroll while recording everything. The truth was being documented. A woman near the bar whispered something to her partner and slowly shook her head. A busboy paused mid-clean, then looked away quickly when the officer noticed. And still, Chief Morrell sat just a few yards away, laughing, sipping his coffee, unaware that the entire plan to arrest him was slowly falling apart just outside his line of sight. Naomi inhaled slowly. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to explain herself. She needed only 2 more minutes. The officer was now giving warnings. Formal ones. He called it a lawful order. Told her she was interfering with public operations. Accused her of creating a disturbance. All while she stood completely still. It would have been laughable if it weren't so real. So familiar. She had seen it before. In grocery stores. In airports. In banks. A calm black woman standing still somehow became a threat in the eyes of someone who needed to feel in control. And that's all it was, control. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about protocol. It was about ego. Naomi could see it in his stance. In his rising voice. In the way he glanced around the room, waiting for validation from the crowd. But validation didn't come. Because the crowd could see it too. They could see that nothing about this woman was dangerous. And everything about this moment was wrong. By 12:48 p.m., the front doors opened. 3 figures in dark suits stepped inside quietly. Naomi didn't smile, didn't flinch. She just glanced once at the man blocking her path. She'd waited long enough. The power shift was about to begin. The moment Naomi Ellison placed her badge and arrest warrant on the counter, the balance of the room shifted, quietly but completely. The same officer who had tried to remove her now stood frozen, his confidence shrinking fast. The weight of his own assumptions was starting to crush him. And Naomi? She hadn't raised her voice once. She didn't need to. Everything she had done, standing still, saying little, letting the tension build, had led to this. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is wait. And now the waiting was over. The 3 federal agents who had entered minutes earlier began moving toward her with quiet purpose. They didn't say her name. They didn't salute. They didn't need to. Their steps spoke louder than words. Everyone could tell they were not there for lunch. They were there for her. But Naomi didn't move. Her eyes scanned the restaurant one last time. The people. The phones. The fear. The disbelief. And then her gaze landed on table 6. The man sitting there still hadn't noticed the shift. Still hadn't turned around. Still hadn't seen the quiet storm building behind him. Chief Vincent Morrell. Well-dressed. Calm. Laughing softly at something on his phone. Completely unaware that the woman he had once dismissed in a boardroom 6 months earlier was now standing just a few steps away, about to change everything. Naomi picked up the warrant and walked forward. Her steps were slow, steady, controlled. Each one a reminder that dignity could not be broken by shouting, or uniforms, or fear. People in the restaurant began to rise slightly from their chairs, not to leave but to witness. Some stood with hands pressed to their chests. Others lifted their phones just a little higher. There was no screaming, no sirens, just silence and tension and respect. Officer Cray remained rooted to the floor, barely breathing. His hand had finally dropped from his belt. His partner had taken 2 steps back and kept his eyes on the floor. The manager had disappeared altogether. No one tried to stop Naomi now. She passed through the restaurant with the quiet presence of someone who had already won. And when she reached the table, she simply stopped and stood tall. Only then did the police chief look up. First confusion, then realization, then panic. Because in Naomi's hand, held firmly but calmly, was the official seal of the federal government, and his name printed clearly on a sealed warrant. He tried to speak. His mouth moved, but no one cared what he had to say anymore. His voice didn't matter now. Not in this room. Not with this audience. Naomi gave a nod to the agents. They stepped forward and produced the cuffs. The entire restaurant held its breath. It wasn't the kind of arrest people were used to seeing. No shouting. No struggle. Just quiet shock and slow motion. As the police chief, once untouchable, was gently pulled from his seat and placed under arrest in front of everyone. The same man whose officers had silenced whistleblowers, who had shredded paperwork, who had lied on camera and smiled while doing it. He wasn't smiling anymore. And Naomi? She didn't flinch. She didn't smirk or say, "I told you so." She didn't need revenge. She came for accountability. And this moment was not about her pride. It was about the truth. And the truth had just stood up and walked across the room. The officers led the police chief through the restaurant and out the front doors. No struggle. No words. Just footsteps echoing across the marble floor. The crowd stayed frozen. Naomi stood alone again, for a moment. And then, something remarkable happened. One by one, people began to applaud. Not loudly, not like at a sports game, but soft, slow, and full of feeling. Like they had just seen something they never thought they'd witness. Justice, calm and complete. The applause spread like a ripple. A man near the door nodded silently. The young woman who had live-streamed the entire event wiped a tear from her cheek. Even the older woman in the corner clapped with both hands over her heart. Naomi didn't respond to the applause. It wasn't for her ego. She accepted it the same way she had accepted the officer's insults, quietly, because she knew what came next. This moment was only the beginning. Outside, the police chief was placed into the back of an unmarked car. The street had grown quiet. Somehow, word had already spread. Cameras waited. Reporters whispered. But Naomi didn't step outside just yet. She had one more thing to do. She turned to Officer Cray. He had barely moved. His face was pale. His mouth slightly open. He looked like someone who had just been hit with a truth too big to understand. Naomi walked back toward him. Not fast, not angry. She stopped in front of him, close enough to be seen, far enough to be safe. He didn't speak, because now he was the one unsure of what to say. Naomi looked him in the eyes. Calm, direct, clear. He had profiled her. He had escalated a situation that never needed escalation. He had tried to remove a federal agent from a public space simply because he couldn't imagine her being in charge. And now, he would have to answer for that. She didn't need to report him, because the room had already done that for her. The recordings, the witnesses, the live stream, the stories already spreading across social media. She didn't need to get even, because she had done her job. And justice was already in motion. Naomi turned without a word and walked toward the exit. As she passed the door, she heard a voice, soft, unsure, coming from behind her. Not the officers. A young man near the kitchen, maybe 20 years old. He said only 4 words. "Thank you for staying." Naomi didn't turn around. She just stepped into the sunlight. The storm had passed. But the change was just beginning. The arrest of Police Chief Vincent Morel sent shockwaves through the city. Not because he was taken down, but because of how it happened, so quietly, so calmly, by someone they never saw coming. The video of Naomi Ellison had now reached nearly 10 million views. It was shared not just on social media but across newsrooms, courtrooms, and classrooms. People didn't just watch it, they studied it. The stillness, the timing, the silence. Every second of that footage had power. But while the world replayed the moment over and over again, real consequences were starting to unfold behind closed doors. Inside the Charleston Police Department, panic had taken root. Whistleblowers who had once been ignored were now being contacted for formal interviews. Old complaints were reopened. Archived footage was requested. Internal emails were pulled. Naomi's investigation had been deep, but it had only touched the surface. Now others began to dig too. What Naomi had done was more than arrest a corrupt chief. She had forced the entire system to look at itself. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a culture that allowed him to thrive for so long. The silence of officers, the fear of speaking out, the unwritten rules that punished honesty and rewarded silence. And now that silence was broken. Officer Darren Cray, who had tried to remove Naomi from the restaurant, was placed on immediate leave pending investigation. But within days, his leave became a suspension, and then a termination. The department tried to release a carefully worded statement, saying that standard procedures were not followed, and that federal personnel should be treated with appropriate professionalism. But no one believed the language. The public knew the truth wasn't in the report. It was in the video. The video showed more than a mistake. It showed a mindset, and that was harder to erase. Cray's partner quietly resigned the same week. He had said nothing during the incident, and in the silence, his complicity had spoken for him. The restaurant's manager, who had tried to move Naomi out rather than confront the situation, was also dismissed. The ownership released a full apology and promised anti-bias training for all staff. A small gesture, but a necessary one. Still, Naomi didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She didn't post. She didn't grant interviews or accept awards. She simply returned to work. Because for every name the public heard, there were dozens more they didn't. And those names were in Naomi's case files. But the changes were not just about punishment. Something bigger had started, a quiet wave of self-examination. Across other cities, departments began reviewing their own bias protocols. Officers were pulled into emergency training sessions. Legal teams rewrote briefing manuals. Civil rights attorneys began citing Naomi's arrest operation as a reference for procedural justice. She had become a model not because she spoke loudly, but because she acted without ego. Her calm had done what loud protests and lawsuits sometimes couldn't. It had forced the gatekeepers to listen. Inside the federal building, Naomi's team spent long days sorting the aftermath. Files had to be sealed. Interviews had to be documented. The chief's charges were just the beginning. There were other names, officers who had falsified reports, supervisors who had erased footage, executives who had ignored complaints. Morrell had been the face, but he had not acted alone. A web of silence had protected him. And now that web was unraveling. Naomi moved through the chaos with the same calm she had shown in the restaurant. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't hurry. She reviewed every detail, every document, every statement. People noticed. Her colleagues began referring to her as the storm without sound, a presence that demanded respect without ever asking for it. But Naomi didn't care about praise. She cared about outcomes. In one meeting, a young officer, new to the department, asked quietly, "What happens now?" Naomi simply pointed to a stack of unopened complaints on her desk and said, "We listen," because that was the real consequence of what happened. Not just firings or policies or press conferences. The true change was in how people now wanted to listen. People who had once looked away when injustice occurred were now speaking up. Employees who feared losing their jobs were now protected by public pressure. Community members who had been silenced were now reaching out, asking questions, sharing stories, demanding better. The lines between law and power had shifted. And at the center of it all stood a woman who never raised her voice, never lost her calm, and never let her dignity go. Days later, Naomi received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just her name in neat handwriting. Inside, a single sentence on a small card. You showed the world what quiet justice looks like. She tucked it into her drawer and returned to work. No speeches, no spotlight, just more truth to uncover. And while Naomi moved forward, the city began to take a deep breath. Schools began teaching the video in media literacy classes, not just as a lesson in power, but as a lesson in presence. Religious leaders spoke of dignity and restraint. Local businesses put up signs reminding customers and staff alike that respect was not optional. It was the beginning of something rare, a shift in culture. Not everyone approved. Some said Naomi should have revealed her badge earlier. Others called her actions too quiet or too calculated. But those voices were quieter now. Because when the truth is undeniable, arguments become small. Naomi never returned to the restaurant where it all began. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't need to. She had already changed the room. And the ripple was just beginning. Weeks passed, and the city of Charleston felt different. Not louder, not more chaotic, just different. It was something in the air, like a long-held breath had finally been released. For years, people had whispered about power and silence and who really controlled what. But now, those whispers had become policy. And at the center of it all was a single moment, caught on camera, when a woman chose stillness instead of fury, and forced a broken system to stop and look at itself. Naomi Ellison had returned to her quiet life. She didn't lead protests. She didn't give speeches. She walked to work like she always had, file folder in hand, face calm, steps measured. But what she left behind in that bistro was more than just a headline. It was a turning point. The Charleston Police Department underwent a full federal review. Not just paperwork, but culture. Every training manual was rewritten. Every officer went through mandatory retraining focused on bias, de-escalation, and accountability. Supervisors were evaluated not by arrest numbers, but by community feedback. A civilian oversight board was created, diverse, independent, and given real authority to investigate misconduct. For the first time in decades, citizens had a seat at the table where decisions were made. Bodycam policies were overhauled. Chain of command reporting was made transparent. Officers who had protected Chief Morell's behavior were either dismissed or reassigned under close monitoring. There were no parades, no banners, just slow, steady change. Because real reform doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, just like the woman who sparked it. Naomi never spoke publicly about that day. She didn't explain her silence. She didn't justify her stillness. Because she didn't have to. People already knew. Her presence that day had said more than 1,000 words ever could. She didn't expose the truth through argument. She exposed it through restraint. And that, more than anything, is what people remembered. A few months later, a framed photo was hung in the lobby of the federal building. It wasn't of Naomi's face. It wasn't even a still from the viral video. It was a single photo of her hand, extended steady, holding the warrant that brought down a man no one thought could fall. Beneath it was a simple brass plate. Justice doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it walks in. Quiet, steady, undeniable. She never commented on the photo. Never stood in front of it. Never even acknowledged it aloud. But the janitor once said he caught her pausing there for a second one night, just long enough to read the plate, before continuing down the hall with her files. Beyond Charleston, Naomi's story lived on. Police academies in other states began using the video in training. Diversity panels brought her name into every room, not as a hero, but as a lesson in clarity. She wasn't held up as a celebrity. She was held up as an example of what it means to hold power without ever having to prove it. Young women wrote essays about her. Teachers shared her story. A law professor in New York built an entire course around response versus reaction, starting every semester with Naomi's case. The teen who had live-streamed the incident went viral too, not for shock, but for truth-telling. She later spoke at her school about what it felt like to see something wrong, and know she had caught it. That small act, filming when no one else dared, had amplified the justice Naomi brought. Together, they had built a chain reaction that stretched across states, departments, and minds. But Naomi didn't watch the news. She rarely checked social media. She didn't need to see the impact to believe in it. Her belief didn't come from likes, or shares, or public praise. It came from knowing that quiet, focused work, done consistently, and with purpose, changes more than noise ever could. She spent her days the same way she always had. Case files, meetings, interviews, names on paper that deserved truth. Names that no one had spoken out for, yet she still wore her hair pulled back, still walked with the same posture, still carried the same quiet strength into every room. But the world now moved slightly differently when she entered. People paused. They listened. They looked twice, because her presence no longer needed an introduction. And the restaurant, Lakeside Bistro, changed ownership. The new manager removed every piece of decor and replaced it with local art, including one painting near the door, an abstract swirl of calm blues and sharp gold lines. No plaque, no explanation, but locals understood what it meant. Just beside it, a sign in simple black text. Here we assume dignity, not danger. One morning, as Naomi walked into work, she passed a mother and daughter outside the courthouse. The girl, maybe 10 years old, held a sketchpad. She looked up wide-eyed. Naomi nodded gently and continued walking. A few seconds later, she heard the girl whisper, "That's her." Not shouted, not screamed, just spoken. And Naomi smiled, for the first time in weeks. Because maybe, just maybe, the world didn't need louder heroes. Maybe it needed steadier ones. The kind who don't demand power. They just carry it. If Naomi's story moved you, share this with someone who believes dignity should never be mistaken for defiance. Where are you watching from? Have you ever been judged before you spoke a word? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in quiet justice, truth, and real reform, hit that subscribe button to support more stories like this.